Welcome to Conspiracy Files with Zoe Parker. I'm your host, Zoe Parker, and in today's episode, we're diving into one of the most enduring and controversial events in modern American history. The assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy on November 22, 1963, remains a source of intense speculation. Was it truly the act of a lone gunman or the result of a far deeper conspiracy? Today, we begin uncovering the layers behind the mystery. In the early 1960s, the United States stood at a crossroads. The Cold War had gripped the globe in a silent and unrelenting standoff. Nuclear anxiety haunted everyday life. Civil rights tensions boiled across the South, and the Central Intelligence Agency operated with unprecedented secrecy. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy had taken office in January of 1961, bringing with him a youthful optimism and a promise of reform. Yet behind the polished image of Camelot, political undercurrents churned. Kennedy's presidency quickly found itself entangled in global conflict. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April of 1961, an attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba, embarrassed the young administration and fractured trust between Kennedy and the Central Intelligence Agency. Later, in October of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis pushed the world to the brink of nuclear war. Through tense negotiations with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, Kennedy secured the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba, but not without making powerful enemies at home and abroad. Domestically, Kennedy had begun to take a hard line on organized crime. Working closely with his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the administration aggressively pursued major crime families. At the same time, Kennedy voiced growing discontent with the Federal Reserve and expressed intentions to limit its control over the nation's currency by issuing silver-backed United States notes, an act viewed by some as a direct challenge to entrenched financial power. In the months leading up to his death, Kennedy's stance on Vietnam began to shift. Early in his presidency, he had approved military advisors to assist South Vietnam. However, by late 1963, internal memos and recorded statements suggested he was considering a full withdrawal after the 1964 election. This placed him at odds with defense contractors, military officials, and intelligence agencies invested in a prolonged conflict. Many researchers point to this convergence of enemies: Cuban exiles, intelligence operatives, organized crime, and powerful political insiders, as evidence that Kennedy's growing independence may have threatened the stability of powerful interests. His visit to Dallas, intended as part of a campaign to unify support across southern states, would mark the final public appearance of his life. As the presidential motorcade wound its way through Dealey Plaza, the stage was set for an event that would fracture American trust and ignite 1,000 theories. On the morning of November 22nd, 1963, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy arrived in Dallas, accompanied by his wife, Jacqueline, Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson, Texas Governor John Connally, and a host of political aides and Secret Service agents. The atmosphere, though tense beneath the surface, was outwardly celebratory. Crowds lined the streets as the presidential motorcade made its way through downtown, offering waves and cheers beneath the clear blue Texas sky. At approximately 12:30 p.m., as the motorcade turned from Houston Street onto Elm Street through Dealey Plaza, gunshots rang out. In the span of a few seconds, President Kennedy was struck twice, once in the upper back and fatally in the head. Governor Connally was also wounded. Chaos erupted. The limousine sped off toward Parkland Memorial Hospital, where doctors attempted to resuscitate the president. At 1 p.m., John Fitzgerald Kennedy was pronounced dead. Less than an hour later, a man named Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested inside a movie theater in the Oak Cliff neighborhood. He had been identified as the prime suspect in the shooting of a Dallas police officer named J.D. Tippit, which had occurred shortly after the assassination. By the evening, Oswald was formally charged with the murder of President Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald was a former Marine who had defected to the Soviet Union in 1959 and returned to the United States in 1962 with his Russian wife, Marina. His background was strange and inconsistent, marked by political extremism, erratic behavior, and suspected surveillance by intelligence agencies. He had been employed at the Texas School Book Depository for several weeks before the assassination, and it was from a sixth-floor window of that building that authorities claimed he had fired 3 shots with a bolt-action rifle. 2 days after his arrest, as he was being transferred from the city jail to the county jail, Oswald was shot and killed on live television by Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner with known ties to organized crime. This stunning moment immediately deepened public suspicion and seeded the foundation of widespread conspiracy. Ruby claimed he had acted out of grief, hoping to spare Jacqueline Kennedy the pain of a drawn-out trial. But his sudden and improbable access to the suspect raised troubling questions. How had he entered a secure police facility? Why had the alleged assassin been left vulnerable? And most importantly, what did Ruby know that never made it into the official record? From that moment forward, the narrative surrounding President Kennedy's death would splinter into multiple paths, some grounded in official accounts, others stretching into the murky depths of hidden agendas and cover-ups. The story of Lee Harvey Oswald, far from providing closure, became the beginning of a much larger and far more complex mystery. The official story, presented by the Warren Commission in 1964, concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. According to this report, Oswald fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository using a bolt-action Italian-made Mannlicher Carcano rifle. The first bullet missed, the second struck both President Kennedy and Governor Connally, and the third delivered the fatal headshot. This sequence, later dubbed the single bullet theory, became one of the most debated aspects of the entire case. The theory suggested that one bullet entered Kennedy's upper back, exited through his throat, then struck Connally in the back, exited his chest, shattered his wrist, and finally embedded itself in his thigh. All of this, according to the report, occurred in just over 6 seconds. Skeptics immediately questioned whether this was physically possible. The path of the bullet appeared inconsistent with the positioning of the 2 men in the limousine. More importantly, if Oswald acted alone, his ability to fire 3 shots with accuracy in such a short time frame was seen by many as highly improbable. One of the key pieces of evidence supporting the lone gunman theory was the so-called Zapruder film, a home movie taken by Abraham Zapruder, a clothing manufacturer who had brought his camera to Dealey Plaza that day. The footage captured the moment of the assassination in graphic detail. Analysts used the film's frame rate to calculate the timing of the shots. Some researchers argued that the timing was just within the capabilities of a trained marksman, while others maintained that it was simply too fast for one person using a bolt-action rifle. The rifle itself was found hidden between boxes on the 6th floor shortly after the shooting, and a palm print matching Oswald's was discovered on the barrel. 3 shell casings were also recovered near the window. The Dallas police later found a paper bag in Oswald's room, which they claimed had been used to carry the disassembled rifle into the building. These items became central to the argument that Oswald had acted with premeditation. Ballistics experts testified that the recovered bullet fragments matched Oswald's rifle. Autopsy photos and x-rays were analyzed, although the procedures themselves were heavily criticized. The autopsy was conducted at Bethesda Naval Hospital under military supervision, and the documentation was inconsistent. Some medical professionals later claimed that their observations were misrepresented or omitted from the official report. The Warren Commission's findings relied on these threads of evidence to build a case against Oswald. But in doing so, it dismissed a number of eyewitness testimonies, alternative trajectories, and unexplained anomalies. The conclusion of a lone gunman failed to satisfy millions of Americans, and the seeds of doubt began to take root. The story was far from over. In fact, the official version would become just one of many competing narratives that followed. As the official narrative settled into the public record, independent researchers, journalists, and whistleblowers began to pull at the threads of evidence. One of the most controversial aspects of the Warren Commission's report was its treatment of eyewitness testimony. Multiple people present in Dealey Plaza that day reported hearing gunfire from the direction of the Grassy Knoll, a small elevated area to the right of the motorcade's path. Some even described seeing smoke or figures behind the picket fence that bordered the area. A police officer, within moments of the shooting, ran toward the knoll after hearing the sound originate from that location. Witnesses like Gene Hill and S.M. Holland were adamant that shots had come from that direction, not just from behind the motorcade. Yet these accounts were downplayed or excluded altogether from the final report. Audio recordings and photographs from that day added to the complexity. One motorcycle officer's radio microphone had become stuck in the on position during the motorcade, capturing a continuous recording that later analysts claimed contained acoustic evidence of 4 gunshots, not 3. In 1979, the United States House Select Committee on Assassinations used this recording to suggest that there was a high probability that a second gunman had fired from the Grassy Knoll. This statement directly contradicted the Warren Commission and reignited debate across the nation. Questions also surrounded the medical evidence. Parkland Hospital doctors who first treated President Kennedy described a large exit wound at the back of his head, suggesting a shot from the front. These observations were documented in real time, but later seemed to conflict with the autopsy findings, which indicated a bullet had entered from behind. The discrepancies in wound descriptions, the handling of X-rays, and the disappearance of key medical records further fueled suspicion that evidence had been altered or suppressed. The Zapruder film, which had initially been seized and kept out of public view for years, became a focal point for independent analysis. Frame by frame, researchers studied the motion of Kennedy's body at the moment of impact. The backward movement of his head, captured in vivid detail, did not appear consistent with a shot from behind. While official experts attributed this to neuromuscular response, others argued it was physical proof of a frontal shot. Further complications emerged in the form of suspicious deaths among witnesses. In the years following the assassination, several people who had offered contradictory accounts or held potentially explosive information died under unusual circumstances. While some of these deaths were explainable, the sheer number, combined with the roles these individuals played, raised alarm. Critics of the lone gunman theory saw a pattern of silencing and intimidation. Piece by piece, these elements began to challenge the foundation of the official story. To many, the evidence did not add up, not in timing, trajectory, witness accounts, or forensic detail. The question was no longer simply about Oswald, but whether the true story had been deliberately hidden from view. As the years passed, more voices entered the debate, many of them skeptical, some openly hostile to the idea that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone. Critics of the Warren Commission pointed to inconsistencies, ignored testimony, and unexplained evidence, arguing that the official account was a carefully constructed narrative rather than a full investigation. In 1966, New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison launched what would become the only public prosecution related to the Kennedy assassination. Garrison alleged that businessman Clay Shaw had conspired with others to assassinate the president, suggesting a wider network of government and intelligence operatives. The trial, held in 1969, brought attention to the idea that Oswald had been part of a much larger conspiracy involving Cuban exiles, intelligence officials, and shadowy figures operating outside of public view. Though Shaw was ultimately acquitted, the trial exposed new witnesses, documents, and theories that would fuel decades of speculation. Garrison argued that Oswald had been framed and manipulated by powerful interests, suggesting the assassination was not only a coup, but a message. Alternative theories proliferated. One common thread involved the Central Intelligence Agency, whose connection to anti-Castro Cuban exile groups, surveillance of Oswald before the assassination, and antagonistic relationship with Kennedy following the Bay of Pigs debacle raised serious suspicions. Some researchers claimed that the Central Intelligence Agency had advanced knowledge of Oswald's activities, while others alleged that he may have been used as an unwitting patsy in a more complex plot. Another theory centered on the Mafia. President Kennedy and his brother Robert had launched an aggressive campaign against organized crime, targeting figures like Sam Giancana and Carlos Marcello. Some believed the mob had the motive, means, and connections to orchestrate a high-level assassination. Jack Ruby, the man who killed Oswald, had ties to the criminal underworld, and his actions seemed to many like a deliberate silencing of a key witness. There were also suspicions about the role of the military-industrial complex. Kennedy's shifting stance on Vietnam and growing distrust of military escalation placed him at odds with powerful defense contractors and Pentagon officials. Documents and memoirs from former insiders hinted that Kennedy's desire to pull out of Vietnam was seen as a threat to strategic and financial interests. In this view, his assassination served to realign the country's foreign policy with more aggressive, interventionist priorities. Even Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was sworn in as president just hours after the assassination, came under scrutiny. Johnson had clashed with Kennedy and faced political scandals in Texas. He also had close relationships with defense contractors and intelligence figures. Though no direct evidence ever implicated Johnson in the conspiracy, his rapid ascent and control of the post-assassination narrative raised eyebrows among researchers. Each of these alternative theories painted a picture of collusion, not coincidence. They suggested that Oswald may have been connected to multiple intelligence and criminal networks, either knowingly or unknowingly. The idea of a lone gunman faded into the background as the possibility of a coordinated cover-up took hold. The real question became who had the power to not only kill a president, but to control the investigation that followed. The possibility of a cover-up introduced a chilling new dimension. If President Kennedy's assassination had been orchestrated by a coalition of powerful entities, then what followed was not merely a failure of justice, but the successful concealment of a national coup. The implications extended far beyond the events of November 22nd. They raised unsettling questions about who truly held power in the United States and how far that power would go to protect itself. In the wake of the assassination, faith in American institutions began to erode. The Warren Commission, intended to restore confidence, instead left many feeling that the truth had been buried beneath legal language and selective omissions. The secrecy surrounding key documents, many of which remained classified for decades, only deepened suspicions. Americans began to question not only the findings of the report, but the very mechanisms of government oversight. By the 1970s, the distrust had spread. The Watergate scandal, revelations about illegal surveillance by the Central Intelligence Agency, and the exposure of secret wars abroad revealed a pattern of deception at the highest levels of power. The Kennedy assassination, once viewed as an isolated tragedy, was increasingly interpreted as a pivotal moment in a larger story of state secrecy and manipulation. Cultural responses reflected this shift. Books like Rush to Judgment by Mark Lane and documentaries like The Men Who Killed Kennedy brought alternative theories into the mainstream. Oliver Stone's film JFK, released in 1991, dramatized Jim Garrison's investigation and reignited public demand for transparency. Though criticized by historians for its speculative leaps, the film forced a re-examination of suppressed evidence and led to the passage of the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act. This law mandated the release of previously classified documents, and in 1992, the Assassination Records Review Board was created. Over the following years, thousands of files were declassified, revealing new leads and contradictions. While no definitive proof emerged confirming a conspiracy, the sheer volume of redacted and delayed materials underscored just how much had been hidden. For many, the idea that the truth could be withheld from the public for so long confirmed what they had feared, that the democratic process could be undermined from within. The assassination became a symbol, not just of violence, but of control, a message sent through silence. The psychological impact was profound. Generations grew up in the shadow of a government they no longer fully trusted. The media, once seen as a watchdog, was now viewed by many as complicit or compromised. The Kennedy assassination had created a fracture in the American psyche, one that never fully healed. It was no longer just about who pulled the trigger, but about the system that made it possible and kept it hidden. As the decades unfolded, the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy became more than a single historical event. It became a cultural fault line. Across books, television, film, and digital media, the event was dissected endlessly, each retelling reflecting not just the details of that day, but the evolving fears and suspicions of the public. The story shifted from evidence and autopsies to something broader, a lens through which people questioned their reality. Mainstream media largely adhered to the official narrative for many years, repeating the findings of the Warren Commission as settled fact. But alternative voices continued to gain traction. Independent documentaries, radio broadcasts, and later, internet forums provided a space where competing theories flourished. The rise of the digital age brought about an explosion of information, and with it, a new wave of researchers began to revisit old evidence with modern tools. Frame-by-frame enhancements of the Zapruder film, digital reconstructions of Dealey Plaza, and algorithmic analysis of acoustic data offered fresh interpretations that challenged conventional conclusions. Even more telling was how the Kennedy assassination became a blueprint for understanding other controversial events. When Americans questioned the official story of the September 11th attacks, many pointed to the inconsistencies of the Kennedy case as precedent. When whistleblowers exposed mass surveillance or covert military operations, observers saw parallels to the secrecy that surrounded November of 1963. The assassination became an archetype, a symbol of institutional deception embedded in the collective consciousness. Popular culture absorbed these themes. Television shows like The X-Files and novels by authors like Don DeLillo and Stephen King wove the assassination into fictionalized realities, blurring the line between truth and imagination. Music, poetry, and visual art all engaged with the tragedy, not simply as an historical moment, but as a metaphor for lost innocence and the danger of unchecked power. Younger generations, removed from the trauma of the event itself, often encountered the assassination as a mystery first and a political reality second. Online, users debated bullet trajectories, Secret Service behavior, and Oswald's background with the same energy they might apply to true crime or unsolved disappearances. In this sense, the assassination became a living narrative, continuously shaped by new voices and technologies. Government efforts to declassify remaining documents met with limited success. While some files were released in 2017 and again in 2021, key sections were redacted or delayed, citing national security. This reluctance to disclose, decades after the fact, only fueled further suspicion. Why, many asked, would the truth about a lone gunman still need protection? Through all of this, the story of Kennedy's death remained fixed in the public imagination, not because of what it answered, but because of what it refused to resolve. It became a mirror, reflecting both the facts and the faith we place in those who govern. And the deeper the questions went, the more the answers seemed to recede into shadow. Beyond the mainstream narrative and the popular counter-theories lies a darker and more speculative layer of the Kennedy assassination story, one populated by fringe researchers, hidden documents, and ideas that push the boundaries of conventional understanding. These theories do not simply challenge the official version. They question the very structure of reality, history, and power itself. One such theory involves the suggestion that the assassination was a ritualized act. Some researchers point to the symbolic geography of Dealey Plaza, noting that it sits on the site of what was once the first Masonic temple in Dallas. The street layout, angles of the buildings, and even the number of shots reported by witnesses are interpreted through the lens of occult numerology. In this view, Kennedy's death was not just a political act, but a symbolic execution, a message encoded through esoteric language, understood only by an inner circle. Others have explored the idea that President Kennedy had come too close to hidden truths. Some point to his reported interest in uncovering information about extraterrestrial life and unidentified aerial phenomena. Declassified memos show that Kennedy requested access to Central Intelligence Agency records on unidentified flying objects just weeks before his death. To those who believe in a broader cover-up of alien contact, Kennedy's curiosity is seen not as coincidence, but as a motive for silencing him. The theory of a shadow government also takes center stage in fringe circles. In this scenario, elected officials serve as public faces, while true decisions are made by an unseen network of intelligence operatives, corporate executives, military leaders, and secret societies. Kennedy, by opposing this structure, whether through his actions in Vietnam, his push for transparency and intelligence, or his challenges to the Federal Reserve, is seen as having violated an unspoken boundary. There are also whispers of time manipulation and predictive programming. Some researchers have pointed to peculiar references in media, literature, and entertainment leading up to the assassination that seem to foreshadow the event. Whether viewed as coincidence, subconscious collective anticipation, or intentional messaging, these anomalies add another layer of intrigue for those who believe reality may be more interconnected than we understand. A particularly extreme theory suggests that Kennedy was replaced by a double before the assassination, and that what occurred in Dallas was not only a murder, but the final act in a broader psychological operation. While evidence for such claims remains thin and highly disputed, the theory reflects a deeper cultural unease, the sense that nothing is ever quite as it seems, and that the truth is always just out of reach. These speculative interpretations are often dismissed by academic institutions and mainstream historians, yet they persist. Their appeal lies not in verifiability, but in the permission they grant to question. For believers, they offer not just an explanation of what happened to President Kennedy, but a window into hidden forces shaping the world. And while they may not align with accepted history, they speak to something undeniable, the enduring hunger to make sense of a moment that forever changed the trajectory of a nation. 60 years after that moment in Dealey Plaza, the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy continues to cast a long and complex shadow. It is not merely a moment frozen in time. It is an open wound, a question that refuses to close. For some, the official story remains sufficient. A troubled man acting alone changed the course of history in 6 seconds from a 6th-floor window. For others, that explanation is too neat, too convenient, and too carefully protected by layers of secrecy. What makes the Kennedy assassination so enduring is not just the loss of a leader. It is what that loss represents. A charismatic president, publicly executed in broad daylight, left behind a legacy of shattered trust. Whether the killer was a lone individual or part of a larger plot, the aftermath revealed something deeper about the American system: its vulnerability, its opacity, and its capacity to obscure its own inner workings. The countless investigations, re-examinations, and releases of classified documents have produced more questions than answers. And perhaps that is by design. A definitive narrative may never emerge. The very act of searching becomes the story. In questioning the assassination, people are also questioning the nature of truth, of history, and of authority. The event becomes a cipher, its meaning shaped by what each generation sees in it. And in the end, the conspiracy may not lie in a single smoking gun or secret memo. It may exist in the silence itself, in what was not recorded, what was not preserved, what was quietly removed or redacted, the gaps between the facts, the moments when logic fails and doubt rushes in. That silence speaks. And what it says is that there are still forces, political, institutional, and psychological, that can shape what the public sees and what it never will. Even now, as technology advances and more documents come to light, the truth may remain elusive, but the search persists. And as long as people continue to ask questions, sift through the archives, and challenge what they are told, the legacy of President Kennedy's final day remains alive, not just as a national tragedy, but as a catalyst for inquiry, skepticism, and the demand for something deeper. Thanks for listening. This has been another episode of Conspiracy Files with Zoe Parker. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to support the show and unlock bonus content, subscribe to the Forbidden Knowledge Network on Patreon. Subscribe now.